Coming up on Global Perspectives, U.S.-India relations, the next step.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Ambassador Meera Shankar from India. Welcome, Ambassador Shankar.
Pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you very much. Why don't we start by having you talk about your experience today in the United States as ambassador compared to the first time you were here as a diplomat in the 1990s. What's the difference and what is the same?
Well, I think there's a big difference in terms of the nature of the relationship. When I was here in the 1990s, there wasn't much substance to the India-US relations. We had just undertaken the economic reforms in India in 1991, July. I came to Washington in September 1991, and part of my job was to persuade people that things had changed in India and that there were opportunities out there which they should look at. I faced quite a bit of skepticism because people told me, oh, we've heard all this in the past, let's see what happens in practice. But we were able gradually to increase awareness. Now today, I find that I don't have to really have this uphill task of increasing awareness. People are increasingly aware of India, aware of India-US relations. The Indian-American community has grown and has significant achievements to its credit. And there's a sea change in the nature of the relationship.
Can you explain to our viewers how the economic reform process came about in India? Because it wasn't there and then it was, and to a lot of people it just came out of thin air, but this was obviously something that developed over a period of several years.
I think people in India were grappling with the issue of how to accelerate growth because our economy was chugging along at a stately pace of 3% a year growth, which sometimes used to be called the Hindu rate of growth. In the 80s, we had some marginal liberalization, which accelerated growth to about 5%. And then in the 90s, we were looking at the possibility of greater reform, but there was greater urgency, which was imparted by the fact that we were also facing a balance of payments crisis, and nothing concentrates the mind as a crisis. So a whole new orientation in the Indian economy was adopted with a greater emphasis on the market, openness to global trade and investment, and liberalization internally.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned that there was skepticism initially, and I think it was a period of such intense change. The Soviet Union was dissolving. There were other countries that were beginning to establish market-type reforms, and so there were lots of questions about what was going to happen next. But I think very quickly India demonstrated that it was moving in the direction that would be very, very constructive for U.S. interests specifically. And so did the skeptics tend to ease off as time went by?
I think certainly we found that interest in trade and investment began to grow. And US companies began to look at the Indian market, particularly the big companies which had deep pockets and larger resources to invest, began to explore the potential of the Indian market. US IT companies began to invest in India. So we did see the beginnings of change and transition in the relationship. I can see today that at a popular level itself in the United States, I mean, if I look around, I see so many yoga studios and all kinds of yoga which I could never even have imagined, you know, Bikram yoga and so forth. And in Washington itself, so many new Indian restaurants, not all of them good, I have to say.
And we've had a similar experience here in Central Florida, but there's been literally this explosion of opportunities to partake in Indian cuisine, culture, and so forth. We hear probably more about the economic relationship between the United States and India than anything else, but tell us about some of the other connections that the two have. India is the world's largest democracy, for example. In terms of political interests, in terms of other interests that connect the two, could you talk about that topic for a minute?
Well, we have shared democratic values with the United States and increasingly convergent interests, whether it be building a secure, stable, and prosperous Asia through an architecture of cooperation that is open, balanced, and inclusive, or it be reversing and defeating the tide of extremism and terrorism, or whether it be keeping open the sea lanes of communication in the Indian Ocean, or it be preserving access to and security and stability of maritime zones and cyberspace and space. There are a number of areas where India and the US can work together. And of course, there are areas such as building mutual prosperity across the world, climate change, etc., where we're also working together.
President Obama recently visited India. From your perspective, what were the main accomplishments of that mission?
I think the visit was a milestone in strengthening our strategic partnership. Both leaders described the partnership as indispensable for building global peace, stability, and security and prosperity in the 21st century. And they've outlined a very, very broad and positive agenda for accomplishing this. I think some of the major achievements were the large number of business deals which were signed. As you know, I think more than $15 billion worth of business deals, $10 billion of which really pertain to US exports to India, helping to create jobs here in the US. And this just kind of showcased the kind of mutual potential there is for trade and investment. Then I think in the whole area of high technology exports and trade in dual-use technologies, we have put in place a far more facilitative framework through the US agreeing to realign its export control regulations for India, and that will have a major impact on the kind of technological collaborations that we can do in future in areas such as nuclear energy, civilian space, or defense. There'll be a lot more potential. And finally, I think President Obama's support for India's permanent membership of the UN Security Council was very, very widely welcomed in India. In the developmental field, we've spelt out a partnership encompassing areas such as agriculture, education, and health, which will have a very positive impact on the lives of people in India. And that's very important because we want this relationship not only to be something, at an esoteric level which governments are concerned about, but to also bring change and positive benefit to the daily lives of people.
Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a bit on the UN issue? This is something we have talked about in many places for years. Is this something that is realistically possible in the near term? And perhaps for the benefit of our viewers, if you could explain a little bit about how the Security Council is structured and why enhancing it, expanding it would be a positive move.
Well, I think, the Security Council and other structures of governance, global governance, emerged after the Second World War, and they reflected the balance of power at that time. But if you look at the world today, it is not just 4 or 5 countries which can determine the outcomes on a range of global issues and challenges which confront the international community. Increasingly, economic power is more diffused. There are emerging economies which are playing a much greater role. Indeed, if you take a look at the global economic and financial crisis, it's the emerging economies which have weathered the storm relatively well, and where growth is continuing to provide momentum to the global economy. So clearly, the structures of global governance are out of tune with the world as it exists today. And if we are to build institutions which can play an effective and credible role and be legitimate in terms of the decisions that they take, then it's important to ensure that these institutions are more representative and more credible to the international community at large. Now, we've seen a shift, for instance, in the emergence of the G20. Earlier, there was only the G8 group of developed countries, which would meet and discuss how to handle the global economy and global finance, and that was sufficient in that world as it existed. But today, it's no longer sufficient, because so many of the emerging economies and what they do impact on the global economy. So the G20 has emerged as a group for much broader based discussion on these issues. And as part of the G20 agenda, they've agreed to reform the World Bank and the IMF, to have voice and quota reform, to give more representation to emerging economies in their structures of governance. But in the political and security structures of governance represented by the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, and so on, emerging countries and emerging economies still have to find greater voice. And one of the issues which has been discussed is the need for UN Security Council reform by expanding both the permanent membership and the non-permanent membership. There are different proposals which are on the agenda. No consensus has emerged on how this reform should be brought about, though there is increasing support for the need for reform. Let me put it like that. I think the UN is currently discussing specific proposals on how this reform should go ahead. I think the important thing is that for countries like India, we have 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who have expressed support for India's membership. And if you take any criteria, whether it is the size of population, whether it is the size of the economy, whether it is the ability to contribute to the solution of global challenges, whether it is the ability to accept global responsibility, I think if you take any criteria, clearly we think that there's a very strong case for India.
Mm-hmm. Where do you place India today? Some have described it as an emerging economy, some have called it an economy that has emerged, a rising power or an established power, a developing country or a developed country. How do you see India today?
I would describe India as a bridge country, because it has both elements of high development and elements of strong underdevelopment. And therefore, we are in a unique position to see both sides of many issues. For instance, we are both a developing country and a democracy. So we, in a sense, give, what could I say, substance to the paradigm that you can both have development and democracy, and that it's not a choice between the two. I think we're also, as I said, both highly developed and underdeveloped. And so we can understand the dilemmas that developing countries face, and also the issues which developed countries confront on areas, for instance, such as intellectual property rights, where we are both a consumer and a producer of IPR. So we understand the need for protection, and at the same time we also understand the need to ensure that IPR monopolies don't impinge on the ability to provide public health and the public good in various areas of concern. And I think this is the unique thing that India brings to the table, the ability to see issues from multiple perspectives because of the very complex nature of our polity and economy at the present juncture.
Now, there are many analysts who say India will be a superpower by the middle of this century. What will that mean? There's always the question, once you become a superpower, what are your intentions? We have this question with China, we have this question with other countries that seem to be on the fast track towards superpower status. What do you think India will be once it reaches that level of superpower?
Well, first of all, I think India itself doesn't see itself as aspiring to be a superpower, if I may use that word. We're realistic enough to recognize that we have such a long way to travel to even come to the level of a middle-income developing country. But there are other attributes which India has which have made it influential even at a time when it was much poorer. For instance, if you take a look at the whole 20th century, then one of the major developments of the post-war world in the 20th century was the end of colonialism. And it was the Indian freedom struggle which provided that trigger, and India which provided the intellectual concept of freedom from colonialism, which then spread across Asia and Africa. We were also at the forefront of the anti-apartheid movement. There are many new concepts which India brought to the table, even at a time when it was not so rich. And I think one of the unique things, if you look at India's history, is that India has never really engaged in any military expeditions outside its borders. Its influence in other countries has spread through peaceful means, through religion and Buddhism, for one, through trade and investment as being other vehicles, and our unique contribution has been, this whole philosophy of non-violence and the greater good, or dharma. Good emperors in India were always those who believed in public dharma, like Ashoka, and not necessarily those who were able to aggrandize their empires.
Now, switching to another topic for just a minute, I know education is one of your passions, and there are multiple opportunities for educational exchanges and mutual benefits between the United States and India. We at UCF have a relatively young India program. We're starting our 4th year, and we're eager to expand the reach and the influence of that program in terms of building bridges between the United States and India, expanding awareness, expanding understanding. And there are many things happening in India today at the governmental level and other levels that will assist institutions in other countries to move in that direction. Could you talk a little bit about some of those developments?
Well, this is a very exciting area you've touched upon. I think the whole area of education has become such a key priority for the Indian government as it seeks to pursue its goal of building inclusive growth and ensuring that our people are equipped to participate productively in the economy. We have just passed a right to education bill which ensures that every child between the ages of 6 and 14 will have free and compulsory education in school, which means that government has to greatly step up the outlays on education at the school level. In the second phase, we probably will expand this. Then we are greatly expanding the university infrastructure. which had suffered in recent years because of shortage of resources. But now we are building many new institutes of information technology, I think 20 new institutes, 7 new institutes of management, 8 new institutes of technology, 14 new innovation universities, and so on. It's a huge and very ambitious agenda. And similarly, in the area of vocational education and skill, we are reorienting and expanding the entire program through a collaboration with industry and a massive investment of resources. To give you some idea, government outlays on education will increase from 9% to 19% during the next 5 years. So it's a huge stepping up of government investment. At the same time, we also are putting in place a regulatory and legislative framework to encourage foreign education service providers to be also active in the Indian market. And there will be opportunities for foreign universities to set up their campuses in India within the framework that is adopted as national policy. There will be opportunities for university to university collaboration, for student exchanges, faculty exchanges. And we have 2 programs between the Indian and US government to catalyze this. One is the Nehru Fulbright Fellowship Program. It was initially a US government funded program, but now it's funded by both sides on an equal footing. The Indian government provides a similar amount, the US government provides a similar amount, and the exchanges are both ways, from the US to India, India to the US. And now we have an Obama Singh Knowledge Initiative, which will also focus on encouraging junior faculty development in India for these new higher education institutions, and therefore it will really fund faculty development programs in the United States for Indian junior faculty.
Now, we have a Young India program here at the University of Central Florida. We have many students from India who are here, many faculty, many students and faculty from here who have traveled to India. But as far as next steps, what would be sort of a 1, 2, 3 of what you would recommend for us as we seek to build new relationships with Indian institutions?
Well, you should look at, existing institutions or even some of the new institutions which are coming up to see if you can work out collaborative partnerships. For instance, if you take a look at the IITs, IIT Kanpur, which came up, it came up in joint partnership with US institutions, including MIT and other institutions, and they partnered in terms of providing a certain number of hours of faculty time. We could do this, you could think of doing the same thing here. You can also work out programs for mutual recognition of degrees with some of the universities in India, so that students could come and spend a semester here, or students from here could go and spend a semester there, and it would be counted towards their credits back in their own university program. I mean, there are many, many ways in which you could try and avail of the opportunities which are opening up.
Good. Could you perhaps share with us what one of your personal goals is as ambassador during your time here? Is there something special aside from what you've already discussed that you would hope to accomplish?
I want to, I think one of the goals that was certainly before me as I came as ambassador was to complete the India-US nuclear deal, which was signed during President Bush's time, but there were follow-on agreements to be negotiated for the deal to kick in. For instance, the reprocessing agreement, and we were able to do that within, in fact, before the time frame stipulated. So that was something which I feel a sense of accomplishment about. The second goal I had set myself was to work with the US to bring about a change in their export control framework as it applied to India. And we have been able to achieve that. I think the third goal was to obtain US support for our permanent membership of the UN Security Council, and we have achieved that. But those are specific goals. I think the broader goal that I have in mind is to build a very dense network of engagement between India and the US, which is not just in one or two specific sectors, but is very broad-based and people-centric, because that will provide a very solid foundation to carry this strategic partnership between our two great democracies forward in future.
Good. Thank you very much, Ambassador Shankar, for joining us today. And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.